Tension saturated the Senate hearing chamber like humidity before a storm. Senator Tim Scott occupied his elevated position at the panel, a self-assured grin cutting through the formal proceedings with calculated ease. Standing directly across from him at the witness podium was Representative Jasmine Crockett, her burgundy blazer immaculate, her natural hair arranged in sophisticated twists, eyes laser-focused and primed for engagement. C-SPAN's cameras captured every frame of what was rapidly becoming one of the most incendiary exchanges in contemporary political memory. Scott leaned toward his microphone, his tone saturated with dismissive condescension. "Representative Crockett," he began, barely concealing his amusement. "I notice here you attended law school. How commendable. But I find myself wondering, did they actually instruct you about constitutional principles, or were you preoccupied with alternative priorities?" The chamber went absolutely silent. Several gasps resonated from the gallery. Scott's grin expanded, clearly savoring what he presumed was a knockout blow. Conservative staffers positioned in the back rows exchanged conspiratorial glances, some extracting their phones to document the moment. This was quintessential Tim Scott, polished, calculated, and what he believed to be devastating. But Crockett didn't so much as flinch. Her jaw tightened incrementally, her eyes narrowing just enough to telegraph what was approaching. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate composure, drew a measured breath, and locked eyes with Scott. "Senator Scott," she stated, her voice steady and cold as forged steel, "before we proceed further, let me ensure I comprehend your inquiry correctly. Are you genuinely sitting there questioning my law degree when you couldn't even pass the bar examination yourself?" The room detonated. Whispers erupted into audible gasps. Scott's grin vanished instantaneously, replaced by a flash of pure astonishment. His face flushed crimson as cameras zoomed in, documenting every microsecond of his sudden discomfort. This wasn't merely a response. It was a declaration of total war. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely incredible confrontation, make certain you smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the political drama currently shaking Washington to its foundation. Now, let's witness how this battle unfolds in all its devastating glory. Tim Scott had constructed his entire political trajectory on being the Republican establishment's preferred voice of measured reason. As the sole Black Republican senator, he positioned himself as a bridge builder, someone who could articulate conservative principles while claiming to comprehend the struggles confronting Black Americans. His polished oratory and meticulously crafted public persona made him a frequent Fox News guest, a rising star whom some whispered could be presidential material. But beneath the smile and the rehearsed talking points existed a man who had never practiced law, never argued a case before a judge, never confronted a genuine opponent who could match his political theatrics with actual substantive expertise. His undergraduate degree in political science had propelled him directly into politics. No law degree, no bar examination, no courtroom experience whatsoever. Yet here he sat, questioning the credentials of someone who had accomplished all three. Jasmine Crockett, conversely, was authentically qualified. Born and raised in St. Louis, she worked her way through Bowie State University, then pushed through law school at the University of Houston. She had passed the bar on her first attempt, something Scott had never even attempted. For years, she practiced civil rights law, defending people who couldn't defend themselves, accepting cases that more established lawyers wouldn't touch. She had been elected to the Texas House, then to Congress, carrying with her not merely political ambition, but actual courtroom battle scars. She understood how to argue, how to present evidence, how to systematically dismantle an opponent's case piece by piece. And now, standing in this Senate hearing room, she was about to demonstrate to Tim Scott exactly what a real lawyer could accomplish. This hearing wasn't merely another routine political theater performance. It concerned voting rights legislation that could fundamentally reshape American democracy. Scott and his Republican colleagues were attempting to obstruct a bill that would expand ballot box access, early voting, automatic registration, protections against voter suppression tactics that had plagued Black and brown communities for generations. Crockett had been invited to testify as an expert witness, bringing not just her political position, but her legal expertise and lived experience. The Republicans recognized she was dangerous, articulate, prepared, and unafraid. That's why Scott had determined to attempt humiliating her early, to knock her off balance before she could present her testimony. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He presumed she was just another politician. He didn't realize she was a trained attorney who knew how to transform a hostile cross-examination into a devastating counterattack. The clip of Scott's initial jab had already started circulating on social media platforms. Conservative accounts were celebrating it as another example of Scott destroying a Democrat. But they had absolutely no conception of what was about to transpire next. The real battle hadn't even commenced. Scott attempted to recover quickly. He sat up straighter, his smile returning, but lacking its earlier confidence. "Representative Crockett," he stated, his voice now carrying a slight edge. "I think you're deflecting from the actual issue here." "Am I deflecting?" Crockett cut him off smoothly, her voice rising just enough to command the room. "Or am I simply pointing out that you initiated this conversation by questioning my credentials when you have absolutely no standing to do so?" She extracted a folder from her briefcase, opening it deliberately, allowing the tension to build. The cameras documented every movement. Other senators on the panel leaned forward, suddenly alert. This wasn't proceeding according to script. "Let's discuss credentials, Senator." Crockett continued, her voice calm but lethal. "I graduated from law school. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I practiced law for over a decade, specializing in civil rights cases. I've argued before state courts, federal courts, and appellate courts." She looked up from her notes, eyes boring into Scott. "What's your legal experience again, Senator?" "Oh, that's right. You don't have any. You never attended law school. You never took the bar exam. You've never represented a single client in a court of law." The gallery erupted in murmurs. A few Democratic staffers couldn't suppress their reactions, sharp intakes of breath, barely concealed smiles. Republican staffers scrambled on their phones, clearly trying to fact-check Crockett's claims in real time. Senator Ted Cruz, sitting beside Scott, leaned over to whisper something, but Scott waved him off, his jaw clenched. He was on his own now, and he knew it. "Representative, I don't think." Scott attempted again. "No, Senator." "Let me finish," Crockett said, her tone sharpening. "Because this is important. You stood here and tried to humiliate me by suggesting I don't understand the Constitution, but let me tell you what I understand." She held up a document. "This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I've actually litigated cases under this law. I've defended clients whose voting rights were stripped away by the exact kind of legislation you're supporting today. I've stood in courtrooms and argued constitutional law while you were giving speeches at fundraisers." The room had gone from tense to electric. Every person present knew they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a political exchange. It was an execution, methodical and devastating. Scott's face had progressed from red to nearly purple. He gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered. "What's irregular?" Crockett shot back. "Is a senator who's never practiced law trying to lecture an actual attorney about legal credentials. What's irregular is you sitting there in judgment of my education when you wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real courtroom." Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, trying to hide a smile, leaned into his microphone. I think the representative has made her point clear. "Senator Scott, perhaps we should move on to the actual testimony." But Crockett wasn't finished. "Actually, Senator Warnock, I'd like to finish answering Senator Scott's question about my education, because I think it's important that the American people understand exactly who's qualified to speak on these issues and who's just playing politics." She turned back to Scott, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Senator, you asked if they taught me about the Constitution in law school. The answer is yes. They taught me all 3 articles. They taught me about the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. They taught me about the 15th Amendment's protection of voting rights. They taught me how to read Supreme Court precedent, how to analyze statutory language, how to construct a legal argument." She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "And most importantly, they taught me how to recognize when someone is completely out of their depth, which, Senator, is exactly where you are right now." The gallery exploded. This time, the chair couldn't even call for order over the chaos. Twitter erupted simultaneously, with the exchange being clipped and shared thousands of times per minute. Hashtags Jasmine Crockett and Tim Scott both rocketed to the top of trending topics, with the clear consensus being that Scott had just been absolutely destroyed. Scott sat frozen, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. His political instincts, usually so sharp, had completely failed him. He'd walked into a trap of his own making, underestimating his opponent and overestimating his own position. The committee chairman, sensing the complete collapse of decorum, tried to intervene. "I think we should take a brief recess." "No," Crockett said firmly. "I came here to provide testimony on voting rights legislation, and I'm going to do exactly that, unless Senator Scott has any other questions about my credentials." She looked directly at Scott, her expression challenging. The entire room held its breath. Scott opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Tim Scott had absolutely nothing to say. "That's what I thought," Crockett said quietly. But the microphone picked it up perfectly. The room erupted again, this time with actual applause from some corners of the gallery, something almost never heard in Senate hearings. She then proceeded to deliver her prepared testimony with devastating precision. Every point was backed by legal precedent. Every argument was supported by constitutional analysis. Every claim was reinforced with real-world examples from her years of legal practice. It was a masterclass in legal argumentation, made even more powerful by the contrast with Scott's earlier attempt to demean her credentials. "The proposed legislation you're considering today would effectively nullify decades of progress in voting rights," she stated, her voice strong and clear. "It would disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, just as similar legislation has done throughout American history. And I don't say this as a politician. I say this as an attorney who has seen firsthand the devastating impact of voter suppression." She detailed specific cases she'd worked on. Elderly Black voters turned away from polls, communities where polling places were shut down with no notice, registration purges that mysteriously affected certain neighborhoods more than others. Each example was presented with the precision of a closing argument, each fact laid out systematically. Scott, still visibly shaken, tried one more time to interject with a question. But his voice lacked any of its earlier confidence. "Representative, don't you think you're being somewhat dramatic?" "Dramatic?" Crockett's eyes flashed. "Senator, I represented a 73-year-old woman who'd voted in every election since 1965. In 2018, she was told her registration was invalid because of a signature mismatch. A signature she'd made with arthritic hands. That's not dramatic. That's reality, and it's the reality you're trying to expand with this legislation." Scott had no response. None of the Republican senators did. They'd expected an easy political win, a chance to score points against a freshman congresswoman. Instead, they'd unleashed a legal mind that was running circles around them. As Crockett concluded her testimony, the energy in the room had completely shifted. The Republican senators who'd been lounging confidently at the start now sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Democratic senators were barely containing their satisfaction, some taking notes as if to capture every moment of what had just transpired. Scott's usual post-hearing routine of talking to reporters was notably absent. He gathered his papers quickly and left through a side exit, dodging the press corps that was desperate for his reaction. His staffers scrambled to provide damage control, issuing vague statements about productive dialogue that fooled absolutely no one. Meanwhile, Crockett stood at the witness table, calmly packing her briefcase as reporters swarmed. She answered their questions with the same precision she displayed during the hearing, never gloating, never showboating, just presenting facts. "Senator Scott started this exchange by questioning my credentials," she told one reporter. "I simply responded with facts. If he felt embarrassed, perhaps he should reconsider his approach to serious policy discussions." It was the perfect response, measured, professional, and absolutely devastating. Within minutes of the exchange, social media had erupted into absolute chaos. The video clip of Crockett's "You couldn't even pass the bar exam yourself" line went viral instantly, racking up millions of views across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The hashtag Jasmine Crockett trended at #1 worldwide, with Tim Scott following close behind. Though the tweets under Scott's hashtag were decidedly less flattering. Memes flooded the internet. Scott's face photoshopped onto boxing ring defeats, game over screens, and courtroom disasters. One particularly viral tweet read, "Tim Scott tried to question a civil rights attorney's credentials and got absolutely destroyed. This is what happens when you bring a political science degree to a law fight." Legal Twitter, always a brutal crowd, was particularly merciless. Verified accounts from law professors, practicing attorneys, and legal analysts all weighed in, most celebrating Crockett's performance as a textbook example of how to handle a hostile adversary. "As someone who teaches trial advocacy, I'm showing this clip to my students," one Yale law professor tweeted. "This is how you respond to bad faith attacks, with precision, facts, and complete command of your expertise." Conservative outlets tried to spin the exchange, with some claiming Scott was ambushed, or that Crockett was disrespectful. But even many conservative commentators privately admitted that Scott had made a serious mistake. One Fox News contributor tweeted, then quickly deleted, "Sometimes you just need to know when you're outmatched. Scott should have seen this coming." Major news outlets couldn't ignore the story. CNN, MSNBC, and even some conservative networks ran segments analyzing the exchange. Legal analysts were brought in to break down exactly why Crockett's response was so effective. "This wasn't just a political clapback," noted one MSNBC legal analyst. "This was a trained attorney using courtroom skills in a political arena. She didn't just defend herself. She completely dismantled his credibility to even ask the question." The Washington Post ran a detailed piece titled, "When Legal Expertise Meets Political Theater, How Jasmine Crockett Turned the Tables on Tim Scott." The article detailed Crockett's background, her legal career, and the growing trend of attorneys entering politics with the skills to match their opponents. The New York Times focused on the broader implications, with Scott's stumble highlights Republican vulnerability on voting rights. The piece argued that the exchange revealed how unprepared Republicans were to defend their voting legislation against substantive legal challenges. Even The Atlantic weighed in with a long-form analysis. "The new generation of Black women politicians, unafraid and unmatched." The article positioned Crockett alongside other rising stars like Stacey Abrams and Ayanna Pressley, arguing that this new generation combined legal expertise, lived experience, and political savvy in ways that traditional politicians couldn't match. The fallout from the exchange extended far beyond social media reactions and news coverage. Politically, it marked a significant shift in the dynamics around voting rights legislation. For Tim Scott, the damage was immediate and severe. His carefully cultivated image as a thoughtful conservative voice was shattered. Donors started asking questions. Fellow Republicans quietly distanced themselves. His presidential ambitions, which had been quietly building, took a massive hit. "This is what happens when you underestimate your opponent," one Republican strategist told Politico on Background. Scott thought he could score easy points. Instead, he made himself look foolish and gave Democrats their best moment in months. For Crockett, the exchange became a launching pad. Donations flooded into her campaign. Progressive organizations that had been lukewarm suddenly wanted her at their events. National Democratic leadership took notice, with some already floating her name for higher office. More importantly, the exchange shifted the entire conversation around voting rights. Instead of Republicans controlling the narrative with claims about election security, Democrats now had a powerful advocate who could articulate the real-world impact of voter suppression with the authority of someone who'd fought it in court. Within weeks, Democratic leadership brought Crockett into key strategy meetings. Her legal expertise and newfound national profile made her an invaluable voice in crafting both the messaging and the substance of voting rights proposals. Beyond the immediate political implications, the Crockett-Scott exchange revealed something deeper about American politics. In this moment, it showed what happens when preparation meets opportunity, when expertise confronts empty rhetoric, when someone refuses to be diminished by bad faith attacks. For Black women in politics who face constant questions about their credentials, their tone, their right to even be in the room, Crockett's response was more than just a clever comeback. It was a blueprint for how to handle dismissal, with facts, with confidence, and with the kind of preparation that leaves your opponent with nowhere to hide. Legal experts noted that Crockett's approach could reshape how attorneys engage in political fights. Instead of playing by traditional political rules, where talking points and sound bites reign supreme, she used courtroom tactics, precise language, systematic dismantling of arguments, and an unwavering focus on facts. What we saw in that hearing room is the future of political debate, one Georgetown law professor argued in an op-ed. As more attorneys enter politics, we're going to see more exchanges like this, where substance trumps style, where expertise matters, where you can't just smile and talk your way out of being wrong. In the days following the hearing, Tim Scott tried to regain his footing. He appeared on Fox News attempting to reframe the exchange as a passionate debate about voting rights. But the host, clearly having watched the viral clips, pressed him on why he'd questioned Crockett's credentials in the first place. "Look, I have tremendous respect for anyone who serves in Congress," Scott said.